Right now, I'm a second year Masters of Environmental Studies student at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University, which means that I am getting ready or beginning the process to write my major paper or my thesis, which is focused on Caribbean development, climate change impacts and opportunities. And for this paper, I'm probably going to zero in on sustainable energy options for Trinidad and Tobago, it being a small island developing state facing the same kinds of impacts that most small island developing states are facing as a result of climate change, but it also being an anomaly because it's a petrostate. So how can Trinidad respond to climate change and to sustainable development generally through looking at sustainable energy? So it's kind of looking at mitigation as well as it being a development issue.
My first, I guess, question was for you to tell us about yourself, what climate research you're involved in, and what motivated you or what motivates you to be involved in this kind of research.
The research that I'm involved in is with partners in Africa. And I lived in Africa. I've lived in Africa off and on ever since I was an undergrad, really. So I have some friends and knowledge of Mozambique, because I taught there for 2 years while I was, right after I finished my PhD. And I wanted to do some work there again. And I had also been to South Africa. And then the Faculty of Environmental Studies got an email from a professor in Nairobi who wanted to establish some research connections with us here at the faculty. And so I wrote to him when I was proposing this new project. It has to do with climate change adaptation and responses of marginalized communities in urban areas to extreme weather events, water-related extreme weather events. And the idea of the project is to investigate how it is that people in low-income communities can develop ways of dealing with extreme weather events, whether it's droughts or floods in urban areas, and make that a viable response. How it is that people who have very close knowledge, very detailed knowledge of what happens in droughts or floods in urban areas, how those people who are experts really in what happens during climate change related events, how they can get that information to government officials and policymakers and make what they know, their expert knowledge, part of the policy process for dealing with climate change in those countries and those cities. Partners that are university-based researchers and also NGO people, community organizations in each of 3 cities, Nairobi, Maputo, Mozambique, and Durban, South Africa. The project is structured around increasing the communication and the research-based linkages between people in low-income areas of those cities and the universities that are based in those cities, so that university-based researchers can have a way of sort of ground truthing what they are studying about climate change and about climate change policy, and local communities can have connections with people whose access to the policy realm is a little bit more direct. The idea is that just as here, I always find students want to do hands-on work. They want to do grassroots work. They want to be making their studies relevant. And I think that's true in Africa as well. It's true everywhere. So if you set up a research project in that way, and design it so that university researchers are working with people in their own local community, it just seems to be something that has its own synergy and seems to be sustainable. Also, funders like that kind of an approach.
How then does education, formal or non-formal education, help in creating those linkages between the community and the university professors?
I think that education is really about learning to articulate. In large part, it's about learning to articulate what you already know.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and then both sides learning from each other.
Yeah.
So it's not just like top-down education.
That's right. That's
Mm-hmm.
right. People in, say, a low-income community a low-income neighborhood that floods every time it rains. And when it rains a lot, it really floods, and houses wash down the hill or wash into gullies in the neighborhood, right? Those people do know what happens when storms come. They know how to deal with it, too. They are aware that, there are certain areas that are more dangerous than others, and that there are potentials within the community for leadership and for emergency response. They tend not to depend on the government to save them, or in any public systems. They are very self-reliant, and that kind of knowledge is something that needs to be built upon, right? In a sense, climate change adaptation needs to start with that kind of understanding of what happens when it rains a lot or when the drought comes, how people respond. And policymakers need to figure out how to remove the barriers that prevent people in vulnerable communities from resolving their own issues. The research project is really about what is it that people are doing? What is the knowledge that's there? How is it that people are responding now? And what needs to happen in order to facilitate that response, that collective response? What kinds of policy barriers need to be removed? And if the will is there, what kind of policies could be put into place to actually facilitate that sort of grassroots adaptation? The project just had a book approved by Routledge and EarthScan, which is going to have chapters by each of the civil society organization partners explaining the work that their organization did, how they gradually began to realize the importance of climate change, or how climate change has affected their work, and how they're moving into doing what can be called climate change adaptation based on what they were already doing before. So the civil society organizations chapters are about that, and the researchers, the university-based chapters, are about the same kind of thing, how their previous research is now expanding and including a climate change focus. I think it's important for students to be part of the discussion, part of the policy discussion. It's important for students to learn about how those UN processes work. They have pros and they have cons, and but the idea of a global democratic process to deal with what is a global ecological crisis and political and economic crisis. I think it's very important that young people not be excluded from that young people be encouraged to exercise their intellectual and their energetic abilities to change the status quo.
The communities that are most vulnerable to climate change, in your case, in your project, the communities that would suffer the most from not having access to clean water or not having access to water in the first place, they are the ones that are victims of structural violence.
Right.
Because the policies that are in place, not climate policy, but general policies, don't maintain the infrastructure that they need.
That's
so,
right.
I mean, climate policy is this kind of nebulous thing that we talk about, but to me it's policy it's everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
It's
right.
economic policy, it's social policy, it's everything.
And you know that because you've been studying climate change and research, and so you see that it is everything. It's about everything. In my view, a switch towards a more equitable political and economic structure at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level is inevitable. Because we can no longer afford to have these inequities. The inequities are pushing people off the edge, and it's just not it's not sustainable. It cannot continue. The real experts in this world on climate change and on what needs to happen in climate change adaptation are the poor people, the vulnerable people, the people whose lives are affected by extreme weather events. And I believe our future depends on bringing those people's voices into the policy process.